That shift didn't just change astronomy, it transformed people's beliefs about our place in the universe. There's a big dose of humility that comes with that. Anytime you're going through some adversity, you might be tempted to have this thought, why is this happening to me? Just by switching that word to the word for, I think is a radically different psychological impact. The world of matter is the materialistic world. And then there's this world of what matters, what's actually relevant to how we should act in the world. Suffice it to say, the metaphors we use to understand ourselves in the world can radically enhance or radically detriment the accuracy with which we are perceiving reality. So the book we're going to go through today is titled Models, Metaphor, and Meaning by Joe Danielewicz. Hey everybody, we're going to be doing something that we've done before today, which is like a solo podcast. So I'm just going to be, I put together an outline. I have it on a teleprompter in front of me. So I'm going to be working my way through this outline to explore a book with you. And apologize in advance. Sometimes people say when I use the teleprompter, it produces crazy eyes. So if you're watching this, sorry for the crazy eyes. The book we're going to go through today, and this is something I've been thinking a lot about recently. Just as a little backstory, this started with me for the book. When I read the book, Metaphors We Live By, which goes into how metaphor is much more than just a device of linguistic flourish. It's something that we actually use conceptually to build thoughts and form concepts. And so that's actually that's the original book that popularized conceptual metaphors and how essential they are. But this book that I'm going to go through today was a little bit it's a newer book, and it's a little bit simpler of an introduction, I think. And it also draws parallels between metaphor and models, like specifically data models. And also talks about how all these things, models, metaphor, and language are used to construct meaning. So the book we're going to go through today is titled Models, Metaphor, and Meaning by Joe Danielewicz. And so this book basically offers a deep dive into the core tools we use to understand our world, which are models and metaphors. The author argues that these aren't just intellectual tools that we occasionally use, that they're actually the very framework through which we see, interpret, and make sense of reality. There's this idea of, you may have heard of linguistic relativity or the Sapir hypothesis. I think I'm saying that right. Where the language you speak or think in actually has some influence on the thoughts you are capable of generating. So I think this is sort of parallel to that, right? The actual metaphors and models we use, you can think of these as like an interpretive schema, right? Like a lens through which we are perceiving reality. These can significantly influence the thoughts we create, the belief structures and worldviews we create from those thoughts, and even color our emotions and influence our actions. So I'll read an excerpt here from the author. Just scroll up a little bit. So at the beginning of the book, the author writes, quote, when we look at a model railroad layout that has tracks and rail crossings and buildings, we use our imaginations to project what is intended by the model layout. Perhaps this layout emphasizes loading and unloading the train. Perhaps the layout invites you to focus more on the train station and the relationship between the railroad and the town. Perhaps the model layout makes you aware of several geographic features that remind you of some real place. The creators of the model layout may have had several themes in mind when they built the model rail layout. The attraction of a model railroad is how it simplifies a part of the real world and makes it easier to comprehend. Models make it easy to, quote unquote, see the big picture or take it take it all in at a glance. Later, the author writes, models are intended to depict something other than themselves. In that sense, they always fall short because they leave out certain features and emphasize other features. They simplify a portion of reality in order to draw attention to certain salient features while ignoring other features. In this way, models are like metaphors, which also simplify a concept and explain it by means of some other idea. So, to try and understand this metaphorically, we could think of, just scroll just a little bit there. Yeah, okay. To try to understand this metaphorically, we could think of models and metaphors as something like a lens or a window through which we're looking through. You don't look at the window per se, you're looking through the window to see what's beyond it. And similarly with a model, you're taking a phenomenon in reality and you're to take something you've perceived and convert it into something you have conceived. You look at it in terms of something that you are familiar with. Same is true for metaphor, right? That you tend to have a target domain, which is the thing you're trying to look at and evaluate and understand. The thing that is new or novel, typically abstract, and you're looking at it in terms of something that is more familiar, right? And so there's plenty of examples of these. Time is money is one of them, right? So people have an embodied experience of using money. And so we metaphorize time in terms of money. You can, how you spend your time, save your time, invest your time wisely, etc. So in this way, models and metaphors are very similar. And this is also, you could maybe generalize this even to the word symbol, where a symbol is something that really, simultaneously reveals something and conceals something else. So it's like a tool for drawing your attention to a certain aspect of a thing. But in order to do that, it needs to draw your attention away from other aspects of the thing. And so this is the means by which we come to understand a thing is by looking at its, looking, quote unquote, looking psychologically at its different aspects through different lenses, different models, different metaphors, etc. Okay, so I'm going to read another excerpt from the book here, and just to kind of set the stage. And after I finish here, we won't do so many excerpts. So, author writes early in the book, quote, "Language lets us exchange thoughts and concepts via spoken and written words. Models communicate complex thoughts and relationships using words and images in a very economically succinct manner. In some ways, models model our method of thinking, our conceptualization," unquote. So I hope you caught that last line there. Models model our method of thinking, right? This is a very meta thing. What the way we look at something can largely determine what we think we see. The example I always like to cite here is before Copernicus, people saw the sun rising and setting for centuries, and they interpreted that as if the sun went around the earth. And then along comes Copernicus with a set of mathematical proofs saying we had it exactly backwards, that it was indeed the earth going around the sun. And everyone was basically forced by mathematical theory to reinterpret the observational evidence of, well, what does it look like when the earth goes around the sun? Well, it turns out it looks exactly like what we would have thought it would look like when the sun goes around the earth. So in this way, models, metaphors, and we won't go into this today, but mathematics itself is a metaphorical system, which I found particularly mind-blowing. Maybe I'll go into the book that talks about that at some point. These things, models, metaphors, theory, informs how we see the world, right? Like we see the same phenomenon, right? The sun rising and setting, but how we interpret that phenomenon is informed by models, metaphors, and theory. So let's jump into the book now. Like if you imagine trying to navigate a maze without a map, like it's basically a trial and error process, right? You're trying to get through the maze and you're going to have fits and starts. But if you have a map, if the line is just traced out for you, then you can obviously just glide through the maze. So without models and metaphors, that's basically what understanding the world would feel like. Models are acting as maps. And I'm going to separately talk about models and metaphors, but for a lot of purposes of this book, I think there's a lot of overlap between them. So I'll just stick with models for now until I'm going speaking specifically about metaphors. So models act as maps that give us a structured way to navigate complex ideas and phenomena. And metaphors, on the other hand, serve as lenses, letting us see one thing in terms of another, often in ways that reveal fresh insights or entirely new perspectives. So again, maps and lenses, we're still talking metaphorically. A map kind of is a lens onto a territory, right? Or it's a window into the territory that it maps. And a lens obviously colors what you see on the other side. So we're speaking metaphorically, but again, there's a lot of overlap between these two concepts. To use another metaphor, you could say metaphors, models, and metaphors are kind of like flashlights in a dark room, that they let us illuminate certain aspects of reality while leaving others in the shadow. So yeah, flashlights, dark room, good metaphor for the way models and metaphors emphasize one thing but de-emphasize another thing, right? They illuminate one thing, but at the same time leaving other things in the shadow. For that reason, no single model or metaphor can ever be a complete representation of reality. All of them have their limits, and they each influence what we notice and how we interpret it. And so this book is really about recognizing that these things are tools, right? And telling us how to use them wisely and understanding their boundaries and limitations. So, this is, if you even think about knowledge itself as a system of symbols, it is largely, it's a model, right? We often use the term mental model. And its language is also constructed metaphorically. Language, speaking broadly here, right? We have natural spoken language that's constructed metaphorically. We also have languages like mathematics. You could even say something like money. We often say money is the language of human action or the language of power. Money too is metaphorical, right? It lets us understand economic goods in terms of numbers, right? So we understand things in terms of their price and looking at them quantitatively rather than qualitatively. And so all of these things are very integral to how we think, how we conceptualize about the world. The farm at Okefenokee is a revolutionary new regenerative agricultural community. It features an 8,000 tree olive orchard, which they use to make their own olive oil, as well as a very large pecan orchard. All the animals on the farm are heritage animals, with some varieties over 100 years old and others thousands of years old. Fresh eggs are produced daily by the farm's chickens. Also, there are over 1,000 beehives that pollinate the over 200 heirloom fruits and vegetables and provide honey to all the residents. The farm makes its own molasses, unrefined sugar, herbs, and spices. The farm also features an herbal apothecary and a commercial kitchen. These are just a few reasons why the farm is the healthiest place on earth. To learn more about the healthiest place on earth, go to okefarm.com and use discount code Breedlove for $21,000 off custom cabin pricing. Again, to learn more about the farm at Okefenokee, go to okefarm.com and be sure to tell them I sent you. Forget multivitamins and other supplements. Animal organs are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. you can get 100 times more nutrients from organs than you can from muscle meats. But the problem with eating organs is that they are difficult to find in stores, they are difficult to prepare, and even when they are prepared well, they often don't taste great. Thankfully, Heart and Soil Supplements has made consuming organ meats so much easier by providing powderized organs in capsule form. Organ meats include everything your body needs to thrive: vitamins, minerals, peptides, proteins, and growth factors. This is why organ meats were the most prized foods for our ancestors. Fortunately for us, Heart and Soil makes these treasured foods easily accessible. So go to heartandsoil.co today and use discount code BREEDLOVE to get started on your journey to optimal health and vitality. Again, that's heartandsoil.co, discount code BREEDLOVE. Have you ever wanted to start a business in the Bitcoin space? If so, then the Wolf Startup Accelerator could be for you. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to businesses developing in the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times each year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. Go to wolfnyc.com to learn more or apply today. Again, that's Wolf, WOLFNYC.com. Okay, so starting with models, which author describes as frameworks we use to map reality. Let's try to define what he means by models. So a model is essentially a structured representation of something that is complex. A model allows us to navigate and interpret that complexity in one way or another. So again, metaphorically, we could think of this as a mental or conceptual map. But as the old philosophical adage goes, the map is not and cannot be the territory. A map always highlights certain landmarks while omitting others, which simplifies reality in order for us to understand it better. And according to the author, there are 4 distinct types of models. The first one is a descriptive model, and this represents what's there. This is one of the simplest types of models discussed in the book, and it's something akin to a photograph, like an actual still image. It really just captures what's in front of us, but without explaining why it's there. So imagine, for instance, you're looking at a subway map. Shows you the stations, shows you the lines, shows you the connections between them, but it's not capturing the hustle and bustle of the subway cars or the people or the sounds and smells of the city, etc. So it's a useful model for understanding the static structure of the subway system, but it leaves out all of the dynamic activity that occurs inside. Now, in science, descriptive models help us map out structures that we can't see directly. For instance, you could think about something like the periodic table in chemistry. It's a model that organizes elements by their atomic number, helping us to visualize the relationships between them, but it doesn't show the atomic structure of each element, nor does it explain why certain elements react the way they do. It's a structured summary, basically, of information that's relevant to one purpose or another, and it gives us just enough information to see the bigger picture, right? It's a kind of a static snapshot, if you will, of the elements. Now, in thinking about this, right, how models are really tools, I think Robert Pirsig in his book Leela has a great way of framing this. And he wrote, quote, "A map of a mountain with polar coordinates is just as accurate as one with rectangular coordinates. But the 2 maps are not the same. The polar map emphasizes certain kinds of understanding that the rectangular map doesn't." And he goes on to say, in just the same way that the metaphysics of quality emphasizes certain aspects of reality, that the traditional dualistic subject-object metaphysics does not, unquote. So there he's referring to his metaphysical framework for understanding the world as a particular map. Just so happens his view is one that transcends subject-object duality. There have been other thinkers like, Neoplatonists and such that also have issues with subject-object. Subject-object is a very useful way to look at the world in many cases, but it's not true. It fails to account for the continuity between subjects and objects. So suffice it to say, the map or the model that you're using is largely contingent on the intentions and purposes and aims of the individual using it, right? So if you're at the North Pole, well, then a polar coordinates map is probably better. And if you're closer to the equator, then you probably need one with rectangular coordinates, right? It really depends on, circumstances and setting, basically, and obviously your aims. So it doesn't mean one map is better than the other. They're just different, right? They make different trade-offs and they're useful in different circumstances. So the second type of model the author highlights is called the explanatory model. And you could think about this as like a detective's blueprint. So an explanatory model goes further than the descriptive one by answering why things happen. So imagine a detective piecing together clues at a crime scene. They don't just catalog the evidence, they actually create a narrative that explains the sequence of events, connecting the dots in a way that reveals meaning, right? Hopefully reveals who was involved, what their motivations were, etc. And in science, an explanatory model works much the same way by taking observations and connecting them to explain underlying causes. Again, this is the domain of theory, right? Where we take empirical observations like the rising and setting sun, but we need to interpret that and attach that to a theoretical understanding that makes sense. And we can be very wrong, right? We can think the sun goes around the earth when in fact we're exactly incorrect. So let's consider an explanatory model like Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Darwin didn't just observe that species varied, he actually provided a model that explained how and why these variations emerge over time. And this model is tied to different observations. This model tied different observations into a coherent theory that could predict behavior across species. It showed not just what happens, but why, connecting the dots in a way that provides deeper understanding. So the Darwinian theory of natural selection really goes beyond the seen products of evolution, right? All the animals and biodiversity and the flora and the fauna, etc. We see all of the products of evolution, but what we don't see are the unseen processes that give rise to those products, right? So this is where Darwinian theory is a very effective explanatory model. It's telling you how and why the things you are seeing came into existence. And so explanatory models tend to be consistently reliable over time, right? If we think about something like mathematics or thermodynamics or Darwinism or Darwinian self-preservation, these things don't really degrade over time, right? They're actually very, very useful frames for understanding things over time, although they might be refined over time, right? Our mathematics tend to get better. Our understanding of thermodynamics is something that's relatively new, and obviously Darwinian theory is it's a couple hundred years old at least. So, but I mentioned that because a model we're going to get into next actually doesn't do so good over time. The next model the author discusses is called the predictive model, which, surprise, surprise, is used for peering into the future. So predictive models obviously make an attempt to look forward, but they're using current knowledge and current understanding to try and anticipate what will happen next. The classic example of this is the weather forecast, which is based on patterns from the past, and the present and trying to map them into the future of what the weather's going to do in the short run. So, imagine your phone tells you there's an 80% chance of rain tomorrow. The app doesn't know for certain. It's drawing on patterns and probabilities to give you a guess, essentially. And predictive models like this, they're essential in fields where outcomes are uncertain, which is many fields, right? Every field is trying to do something, create an outcome in the future, needs to work in the realm of probabilities and uncertainty. And so these predictive models can help us prepare and plan by estimating what's likely to happen. But however, like weather forecasts, they can't guarantee accuracy because they're based on probability, right? The horizon of the future is irreducibly uncertain. Obviously, the closer it gets, we can make higher probability bets that certain things will happen and certain other things will not. But there's always this possibility of the unexpected happening, basically. So these predictive models remind us that while patterns can suggest trends, they cannot capture the full unpredictability of the real world, right? That's the thing. It's irreducibly unpredictable, basically. So predictive models, although they are very important for immediate planning purposes, right? When you're trying to choose what clothes to pack for a trip based on a weather forecast, or where to invest business capital based on a market forecast, for instance, these models tend to be less reliable the further out they look in time, right? A weather forecast 2 weeks from now is almost useless in most places. You go into the years or decades, it's, the utility of it drops to near zero. Business forecasts, I think, are probably even worse, right? That you can get some data in the short run about what to do and where you think trends are going to go. But if you go, 10, 20, 40 years into the future, we have no idea. We have no idea what innovation is going to do. We don't know, geopolitical situation, nothing. So predictive models, useful, but tend to be more useful in the short run, where the explanatory model, like Darwinian theory of natural selection, tends to be something that's more robust over time. Do you want to give your kids a foundation of freedom and understanding of Bitcoin and a healthy skepticism of government? Then you should try Tuttle Twins. It's a cartoon about a grandma with a time-traveling wheelchair who takes her grandkids on hilarious adventures to learn about economics and freedom. Think the education of Magic School Bus meets the comedy of The Simpsons. With Tuttle Twins, your kids can learn about Bitcoin from Satoshi Nakamoto, civil disobedience from Harriet Tubman, natural rights from John Locke, and how to destroy the economy from Karl Marx. Today, Hollywood greenlights a lot of woke content or mindless garbage. Each episode of Tuttle Twins is parent-funded, parent-vetted, and only released when it's parent-approved. Because Tuttle Twins is fan-funded, it was the world's first kids show to teach about Bitcoin. That episode alone has been seen over 40 million times and was tweeted about by Michael Saylor. You can watch episodes of Tuttle Twins for free right now. And if you like what you see, you can use code Breedlove for 10% off a subscription to the Angel Studios app and watch all of the episodes. So go to angel.com/Breedlove to discover Tuttle Twins today. And remember to use code Breedlove for 10% off. One of my highest health priorities is keeping my brain in top shape. To take care of my brain power, I do many things, such as striving to read, write, exercise, and meditate daily. One of the latest tools in my brain power toolkit is MindLab Pro. MindLab Pro is a nootropic supplement that is scientifically proven to enhance your brain power. When I take MindLab Pro, my mind feels like it has a better grip on the world, my thinking is more lucid, and the articulation of my speech is radically improved. MindLab Pro has been tested in rigorous, double-blind, placebo-controlled human trials and has been proven to enhance brain power for users in every age group. MindLab Pro is an advanced formulation of 11 nootropic ingredients and is backed by research from over 1,400 human trials conducted over the past 32 years. So if you're looking to enhance your brain power, MindLab Pro is an excellent solution. Go to mindlabpro.com/breedlove to start enhancing your brain power today. Again, that's mindlabpro.com/breedlove. Do you think you know who will win the presidential election, or how many seats the Democrats or Republicans will win in the House or Senate? Well, there's finally a legal way to bet on the outcome of these elections via a platform called Kalshi. Kalshi is the first legal exchange where you can bet on any event, including but not limited to elections. Kalshi has markets on who will win the presidential election, who will control the House and Senate, who will win swing states, and more. Kalshi is already being used by hundreds of thousands of people and has facilitated over $1 billion worth of trades. Let's take an example. Right now, Trump and Kamala are trading about 50-50, meaning you can place a bet on either and you will double your money if they end up winning. That's pretty good, and Kalshi has hundreds of markets just like this for you to go and play in. So go to kalshi.com/breedlove today to start playing in this predictions market. The first 500 traders who deposit $50 will get a free $20 credit. Again, that's kalshi.com, kalshi.com/breedlove. The next type of model the author discusses are normative models. And you could think about these like recipes for action. So a normative model is prescriptive rather than descriptive or explanatory. So imagine a cookbook or a book of recipes. The recipe isn't just a list of ingredients, which would just be explanatory. It also includes a set of sequential instructions that guide you on how to combine ingredients to achieve a specific result. All right. And normative models are similar to this. They're like recipes for behavior that outline the actions you ought to take, or how things ought to be rather than how they are. So in society, we see normative models in ethical codes, in the rule of law, in cultural norms, all of these ways where people do things that they've created mutual expectations, right? There's a certain, people shake hands, for instance, right? People might say, good day or bonjour or whatever the thing. There's certain like protocols of interpersonal communication. And these are just all norms, right? They're things that people normally do. And you basically could call these normative models. So, what's like a legal example here? We could look at something like the U.S. Constitution. It's not necessarily a description of how society operates. It's a set of ideals for how society ought to operate or how society should operate, given a certain set of moral presuppositions. And I would say the U.S. Constitution is largely based on the King James Bible, things like thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, etc. These form the foundation of the ethics that are encoded in something like the U.S. Constitution. And so normative models like the U.S. Constitution provide a framework for action, basically, shaping people's behaviors, expectations, purposes, aims, etc. And it's not something that claims to represent reality. They aim to influence it, right? Directing us toward a particular vision or set of values or patterns of action more broadly. So, a normative framework, right? The philosopher David Hume famously said, you can't get an ought from an is, which means something like a description of reality cannot generate a prescription for how to deal with that reality. So we kind of have these two different worlds, two different sides of the world, right? There's the world of matter, right? Just the materialistic world. And then there's this world of what matters, what's actually relevant to how we should act in the world. And again, if human flourishing is our aim, which if you're a living, breathing human, it basically ought to be, right? If that's not your aim, then by virtue of you being alive, you're engaged in a performative contradiction, right? If you don't think human flourishing is a good thing, then why are you flourishing as a human? So given that human flourishing is almost like this performative aim that we have just by virtue of being alive, then we can say that there are better and worse normative models. And again, this is like the domain of religion, morality, ethics. These are the areas where those codes are developed that best serve human flourishing. So, for instance, if we had a normative model in a society that normalized cannibalism, right? People eating people, and say that was considered normal and moral in a certain society, well, that society would disappear pretty quickly because guess what? Those people would eat each other, and a society where cannibalism was not normal or moral would outcompete, would outpopulate the one that did not see it that way. So obviously that's an extreme example, but the societies that adopt the patterns of action that are most conducive to their reproductive fitness, to use a Darwinian term, will succeed relative to those that do not. So normative models, although they don't describe reality, they're telling us like what should be rather than what is, they radically influence how we develop in the world, right? It's foundational to our identity, our belief structures, and therefore the actions we carry out in the world. Okay, so those are the 4 types of models. Now let's flip over to metaphors, which the author describes as something like the lenses through which we interpret reality. Again, while models offered a structured way to map reality, metaphors allow us to see one thing in terms of another. And again, you see the author kind of like mixing metaphors here between windows and maps, and again, a lot of overlap between these two concepts. But the author basically treats metaphors as cognitive tools, which are ways of relating concepts that help us bridge. You gotta go down. Help us bridge the gap between the known and the unknown. So one very popular metaphor that we've probably all heard is that the brain is a computer, right? And this may seem really harmless, but I want to try to unpack why the metaphors we use have serious consequences. So this comparison, right, between a brain and a computer, it suggests that our brains, do things like a computer does, right? Process information, store memories, run programs. It gives us this intuitive way to understand the complexity of brain functions. And it also gives scientists a framework by which to study cognition. So useful, but also limiting, because the brain isn't really a computer, right? It's an organic, adaptable network with nuances that go well beyond circuitry and semiconductors. So thinking of the brain purely as a computer might make us overlook, let's say, its emotional and creative capabilities. And the authors suggest that while metaphors can be very helpful, they're always partial in this way, right? They illuminate certain aspects but obscure others. So, and I think the other thing here, and the author doesn't go into this so much, but very important for understanding metaphor, you can see this brain as a computer metaphor also highlights how we use our, basically technologies we are familiar with to metaphorize more complex systems and things we don't understand. All right, so the computer is pretty much the most sophisticated form of electronic equipment that we're all familiar with, right? You could, even the smartphone is kind of like just a little computer, basically. So we are trying to understand ourselves, our own cognition, in terms of the most sophisticated equipment we have, right? And prior to the existence of computers, well, people didn't have that source domain of the computer to metaphorize their understanding of the human brain. So to give you another example of this, This one blew me away, actually. I read a Twitter thread on this recently, which we'll link to in the show notes. Most people have long believed that the heart is a pump, right? So this clearly, a pump is just an antiquated industrial age metaphor. And by taking our understanding of how a pump works, we can apply this simple model or simple metaphor for understanding how we think the heart works. However, when you model the heart with modern computers, scientists now consider the heart to be a vortex generator that's spinning and mixing blood. And the implications of that might sound, you might be like, oh, well, what's the big deal? It's either pumping blood or mixing blood. What does it matter? Well, if you consider that the heart is a vortex structure, all of a sudden it makes sense how this structure can have higher fidelity to the surrounding reality than even the brain. So if we take a metaphor, let's take this vortex metaphor a step further. The philosopher and physicist David Bohm has this theory of the holographic universe, which itself is obviously metaphorical. A hologram is something in which each part contains an image of the whole, basically. And we could consider the heart to be a localized projection and receiver of the cosmic hologram. And I'm going to explain why. In this vortex generator metaphor of the heart actually has a torus-like or a toroidal, hope I'm saying that correct, shape. And if you Google a torus, it's like this kind of like a donut shape, but with a twist on it. And so this shape actually mirrors the structure of space-time according to the work of Nassim Haramein. And according to Nassim, he says the universe is this vast multi-dimensional torus. And so if we consider that the heart is shaped like a toroidal field and the universe is shaped like a giant torus, well, then the heart could be this microcosmic reflection of the universe, right? So just by switching our metaphorical understanding of the heart, we go from this thing, it's like, oh, it's just this organ that pumps blood, to this holographic conceptualization of the heart as a map of the cosmic totality, right? Like, again, just with a simple flip of the metaphor. Now, this is an extreme example, obviously. A lot of this theory is, people will have arguments that, it's unfounded or unproven. But just to give you a sense of how tremendous understanding can be changed by changing metaphor. And this would also explain the age-old advice, right? When people say, oh, always listen to your heart. Well, if it's true that the torus-like structure of your heart is tapped into the torus-like structure of the cosmos, well then, according to like hydrodynamics, Matt, where there's a deep interconnectedness. You could look at something like hydrodynamics, basically, where the movement of any particle in a pool of water is influenced by the movement of every other particle, right? So everything's interconnected. All of a sudden, we would say that, the heart is it's capable of sustaining much higher data throughput than the brain, perhaps. So, and we also know there's neurons in the heart. So all of these things, start to make a little more sense when you just change your metaphor. And it really, I just think it's hard to overstate how radical that is, right? Just as we then create new tools and technologies that inform new metaphors, that we change our ability to understand the actual nature of reality. So there's this kind of co-evolutionary dance occurring where we are upgrading our hardware, our external tools, and that in turn updates our cognitive software. And in preparing this part of the outline, I was reminded of this excerpt from the book Black Elk Speaks. And this book is about a Native American and his philosophy. And in one part, Black Elk is conveying a very profound idea that each individual actually embodies the center of the universe. And he's emphasizing the omnipresence of what he calls the Great Spirit. And he writes, quote, "At the center of the universe dwells the Great Spirit. And that center is really everywhere. It is within each of us," unquote. So this perspective underscores the interconnectedness of all beings and the divine presence within every individual. Now, this may sound like some woo-woo magic stuff to, someone who considers themselves to be scientifically rational. But if the heart is this torus-like structure and the cosmos is this torus-like field, all of a sudden that woo-woo stuff from Black Elk starts to sound a little more rigorous. So suffice it to say, the metaphors we use to understand ourselves in the world can radically enhance or radically detriment the accuracy with which we are perceiving reality. So next, the author goes into metaphor as a tool for innovation and discovery. Metaphors, as we've just covered, right? They open doors to new ways of thinking. A good example here would be when Albert Einstein described gravity as the bending of space-time. He gave us a metaphor that allowed people to visualize how massive objects interact. And this metaphor wasn't literal, obviously. Space isn't made of fabric or a rubber sheet. But the metaphor is instrumental in helping people understand general relativity. And so, you've probably seen this, right? It shows a sheet. You put a big ball in the middle, and you put lighter balls around the edges. And the distortion of that sheet is a metaphor for how much gravitational pull the larger object has relative to the smaller object. So you roll the small ball around the large ball, and it will orbit just like planets orbit stars. So, and this was, again, he called it the fabric of space-time, actually. So consider how we talk about time. In English, we use metaphors, as we said earlier, like saving time or spending time as if it were money. This is actually shaping how we perceive and prioritize our time, often treating it as a scarce resource. Now, we take that for granted in the West. We think, of course, time is a scarce resource. What else could it be? But other societies, other cultures don't view time this way, right? There was a time when people considered time to be cyclical, right, rather than linear, and not something to be spent, saved, or invested. These terms didn't really exist in a lot of cultures for many or most epochs in human history. But rather, time was something that was just orbital, seasonal, transitional, right? Just something that changed in endless cycles. And so when we explore metaphors this way, the author is showing us that they're not just linguistic tools, that they're actually psychological frameworks that impact what we value and how we act. Now, however, and we touched on this earlier, but as great as metaphors are and as indispensable as they are, they can also suffer from limitations. So you could think of a metaphor, if you over index on the literal meaning of the metaphor, right? If you don't take it to be a metaphor and you mistake it to be something literal, it can trap you. Imagine a cage. Like a bird is in a cage and it can see the world beyond, but the cage is limiting its movement. And in the same way, when we cling too tightly to a metaphor, we can confine our thinking within its boundaries. So to draw an economics example, for instance, if we consider the metaphor of the invisible hand that was popularized by Adam Smith, this metaphor suggests that market forces naturally guide the economy toward an equilibrium state, almost as if some hidden force were orchestrating it. However, this metaphor can also lead to oversimplified thinking, right? The economy isn't guided by the hand of God or some autonomous entity. It's the result of, myriad complex human interactions, reactions, government policies, power dynamics, innovation, change, even weather. All of these things influence this storm of human interaction that we call the economy. And if you just think there's an invisible hand guiding the whole thing, well, that might obscure the way we think about social structures, policies, even human intentions, and how human intentions shape economic outcomes. So the author here encourages us to always remain flexible with our metaphors. We need to use them to explore rather than limit or confine our understanding, right? It's just don't mistake the map for the territory ultimately, right? Again, there's a saying that all maps are wrong, some are useful, some are dangerous, something like that. So I think the dangerous maps are the ones that you take to be the territory, and that's what the author is warning against. And again, all forms of knowledge, models, metaphors, these are all provisional tools, right? That they cannot provide any final solutions, and they're always subject to the intentions and aims of their users, right? What works for you might not work for me if I have different aims or intentions. Before starting the What is Money show, I spent most of my career as a CFO, overseeing internal technology implementations and business acquisitions. Over the next 10 years, it is projected that over 12 million businesses in the US will be sold. If you are an operator running a business generating between $5 and $200 million of revenue, and you're considering selling your business within the next decade, then there is a significant opportunity for you to deploy technology to streamline business processes, reduce operating costs, and enhance the multiple your business ultimately sells for. To this end, I am partnering with the team at Emerge Dynamics, a firm with decades of experience in maximizing the value of privately held small and middle market businesses. Go to emergedynamics.com/breedlove to learn how you can build an attractive, high multiple company that maximizes your return when you fully exit. Again, that's emergedynamics.com/breedlove. This December 17th to 21st, 2024, join me on the Pacific coast of Mexico for our men's retreat, The Art of Alpha. At this world-class retreat center, we will have daily meditations, movement practices, yoga, cold plunging, infrared sauna, and many other biohacking modalities, all while enjoying world-class cuisine designed for optimal full-body health. The retreat center is a gorgeous biohacker's paradise located right on the ocean. You can think of this place as a nervous system reset facility. At the Art of Alpha, we are seeking men who wish to cultivate freedom, wisdom, sovereignty, physical fitness, truth, and love in themselves and in those who look up to them. If you've always felt motivated to push yourself to new limits to discover the best version of yourself, but you've struggled to find the right community to immerse yourself in, then the Art of Alpha is for you. To apply to join the Art of Alpha, go to breedloveevents.com. Again, that's breedloveevents.com to apply to join us for the Art of Alpha on the Pacific coast of Mexico this December 17th through 21st, 2024. So we've talked about models, we've talked about metaphors. Now let's go one layer deeper, which is the concept of meaning itself, right? Obviously, the idea behind these models and metaphors, symbols, knowledge is to understand the meaning of them, right? To get closer to the meaning, to answer questions about reality, right? So if we bring models and metaphors together, we can explore how the confluence of these two things create meaning. And so the author's arguing that meaning isn't something that's just out there waiting to be discovered, right? It's not some latent attribute of reality. It's something we actively construct. To use a metaphor, imagine you're building a house. Models could be something like the bricks. Metaphors are are, maybe the mortar that hold the bricks together, and language is like the blueprint or the design for the house. And together, that coherent structure that we call a house would be, in this metaphor, meaning, right? It's the confluence of language, models, and metaphor. And again, these, a lot of overlap here because language is a model, language is metaphorical. Metaphors are a model as well. Models, you could say, are metaphorical in the sense that you're interpreting one thing in terms of another. If you wanted to reduce this all the way down to a word, I would say you could sum it up in the word rationality, properly understood, which is a ratio, right? It's in the word rationality. A ratio has a numerator and a denominator. You're basically comparing two things, right? Or looking at one thing in terms of another thing. This is also mirrors the structure of metaphor, in which you have a target domain and a source domain. So you're interpreting one thing in terms of another thing. So this process of comparison and aspectualization of different things in a lot of different ways is the process of discovery we call meaning, basically. So the author then goes into language as a model and a metaphor. So he's saying that it's actually both, as I said earlier. Each word is a symbol. It stands for something else, which simplifies reality into manageable chunks. You can think of the word tree. It represents an entire living organism, but the word doesn't convey, the smell of pine, the feel of bark, the shade of its leaves, etc. Language basically gives us this mapping tool again, and the map cannot be the territory. Now, different languages, like different models and different metaphors, are going to offer unique models or unique perspectives of reality, basically, or unique aspects on reality. There's a classic example here of the Inuits, who are Eskimos that have dozens of words representing snow, right? Each of these words that they use describes a slightly different type of snow. And we don't have that in English because English speakers may not have the need to notice all these nuances of snow to the same extent that the Inuit do. And so, once again, it doesn't mean English is better and that the Inuit language is worse. It just means that they live in snow, so they need to deal with a lot of different types of snow, and there's a lot of different subtleties that they're navigating that we're not. So the tool, the usefulness or the utility of the tool, in this case language, is contingent on who they are, right? Their circumstances, their setting, etc., as is ours. So language shapes, how we experience and interpret the world, but it's also guiding our thoughts and perceptions, hopefully to what is most relevant in our fields of action, basically. Next, the author talks about beliefs as models and worldviews as metaphors. So the author points out that our beliefs and worldviews are tied to the models and metaphors we adopt. You could imagine your worldview as a pair of binoculars, to use a metaphor. Each model or metaphor acts like a lens, focusing on certain aspects of reality while blurring others, right? Kind of like the flashlight metaphor. If you adopt a scientific worldview, for instance, you might see the world in terms of cause and effect, laws, systems, etc. If you adopt a more spiritual worldview, on the other hand, you may see the world as interconnected, meaningful, purposeful, etc. So, consider again, back to the transition from a geocentric to a heliocentric model of the solar system. That shift didn't just change astronomy. It transformed people's beliefs about our place in the universe, right? We went from thinking Earth was the center of the universe to thinking Earth is just one planet orbiting one of trillions of stars and one of trillions of galaxies. There's a big dose of humility that comes with that. So our choices of models and metaphors can radically alter how we see ourselves and our purpose in this universe. again, the author is arguing that meaning it's a dynamic, evolving process. It's not a static structure. To use another metaphor, imagine you're building a mosaic, constantly adding new pieces to it. Each new experience, each new model or metaphor adds to the mosaic, reshaping our understanding. Scroll down. Meaning in this way is never static. It can't be static, right? It's an evolving construct that grows as we do. Look at something like the genetic code. When scientists initially discovered DNA, they used the metaphor of a code to describe it, seeing genes as just a set of instructions like machine code. But as genetic research and science have progressed, scientists have realized that it's way more complex than that, right? Genes are influenced by environmental factors. We have the whole idea of epigenetics now. There's many layers of interaction or meaning that flow between genetic code and the environment. And so the author's arguing basically that meaning is not something that we ever finish. It's an ongoing process of reinterpretation. It's not a product of any kind. So, okay, I've brain dumped a lot on you about this book. What are the practical implications of all of this? What are the practical implications, let's say, of applying models and metaphors mindfully? Well, I think the author's ideas have really broad implications for science, philosophy, and everyday life. So in science, again, looking at models as provisional tools rather than fixed structures that are either right or wrong, this is encouraging of humility, basically. It's like you're understanding that whatever your view of the world is, you're basically wrong to some extent, right? Knowledge is inherently wrong. It's the idea of knowledge and models and metaphors is to try and be less wrong, right? To try and refine them over time to get closer to the truth, right? To get closer to discovering what is useful. And this will hopefully, if people really internalized this view, this could de-escalate ideological conflict. It's like, oh, you just understand that, there's one way to look at the world and there's another way to look at the world. There's not necessarily right or wrong. That's not to say there's not morally right or wrong. As we said earlier, if human flourishing is the aim, which you're sort of, you're indicating by virtue of being alive that you value human flourishing, that there are things that enhance that and there are things that decrease that. But it does mean that, these ideological conflicts over, my God is better than your God, we could perhaps de-escalate these. And maybe also scientific arguments where people, get very tribal and in their little camps about what they believe and they just, fling poo on everyone else. Well, maybe we could de-escalate some of that with a better understanding of the model and metaphorical nature of epistemology. So models in science, again, useful, but they're always provisional, which means they're always works in progress. They're never a finished product. Even things today, we have like quantum mechanics, relativity. These are both models that explain different aspects of physics, and they're both accurate in certain contexts, but they don't completely align, which highlights the limitations of each model, right? And when we see models as provisional, hopefully these scientists are more likely to remain open to new discoveries and perspectives, which allows or even optimizes for scientific progress, rather than rigid scientific dogma, which is very inhibiting to human flourishing. Other implications for this. So in philosophy, if metaphors are tools for dealing with complex ideas, metaphors then play a critical role in communicating complex ideas. Philosophers use metaphors to bridge abstract concepts and lived experiences and make the intangible tangible. For instance, we go with a classic philosopher like Plato, who has the infamous allegory of the cave, where he uses metaphor to illustrate enlightenment, helping us to understand how people move from ignorance to knowledge. The author in this book, he's showing us that metaphors aren't just decorative. They are integral to philosophical exploration. We cannot deepen our understanding without metaphor. Metaphors help us express ideas that would otherwise be difficult to communicate, or even impossible to communicate, frankly. Other implications, practical implications for this book, this in daily life. I think it's a good way to help us build adaptability and resilience. So being aware of our models and metaphors can increase our adaptability once we understand their true nature, right? When we understand that our beliefs are constructed through models, we can examine them more critically, making room for change. Recognizing the models and metaphors at work in our thinking allows us to approach situations flexibly and build resilience. Imagine dealing with a challenging situation at work. If you view it through a growth metaphor, for instance, you might see it as an opportunity to learn, grow, become better, wiser, etc. But if you instead frame it as a battle, well, you might feel extra combative or defensive or, treating it like a life or death situation. But so this, it shows you, like, when you choose your metaphors carefully, you can actually shape how you respond to life's challenges. One really simple one here and I got this from Robert Grant when he was on the show. Anytime you're going through some adversity, you might be tempted to have this thought: why is this happening to me? I don't think this is too uncommon for a lot of people that have gone through different challenges in their life. Just by switching that word to the word for, I think is a radically different psychological impact. I've just tried to train myself now when I'm going through adversity to try and reframe that phrase that sometimes runs through my mind to: why is this happening for me, right? So you kind of retool your lens on your own personal experience to discovering what you can learn from a given set of adverse events or sequence of adverse events. So just that little, it's barely, the change from one article to another. And it, for me, was really impactful on just how I respond to adversity. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you found it useful, insightful. I've really found the metaphor rabbit hole to be very exciting, and it's led me into the models and meaning and all these other things. So just to put a button on this, again, the book Models, Metaphor, and Meaning by Joe Danielewicz. Basically, it's inviting us to rethink our relationship with the world, right? Models and metaphors, they're tools, but they're not just tools, right? They're frameworks through which we construct meaning. They shape our understanding of both ourselves and the world. They guide our actions, and they influence how we see ourselves and other people. And in the end, the author's message is pretty clear. Understanding or meaning, creating meaning, this is an evolving journey. There is no final destination. There's no final understanding. There's no final meaning. It's an ongoing, endless process of discovery that we're all engaged in. And you might think that sounds problematic, but I think it's actually exciting, right? If there were a final destination, what would we do when we reach the final destination? So thank God it's an ongoing journey. And I think by embracing this plurality in our models and our metaphors, we can build a richer, more flexible approach to understanding the world and to constructing meaning. So thank you guys for joining me on this exploration. And let's keep those flashlights handy so we can continue to cast light on the complex world around us whenever and wherever we need to. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.